The self is non-objective. It is never a known object, and it is never an unknown object. In self-knowledge, the knower, the knowing, and the known are one and the same thing. For self-knowledge, or self-realization as we call it, abandon the objective outlook. That is, relinquish the tendency to misidentify the self with what is not the self, that is, with anything objective whatsoever. The self is never an unknown object. It is never unknown, for you exist and you know that you exist. And the knowledge of the existence is of the existence or by the existence itself. No second thing, person, or instrument is involved. You are, and you know that you are. It is not unknown. The existence, though, is not something perceivable or conceivable, and all that is perceived or conceived is not a definition for it. So it is never known in that sense. Thus, an Upanishad refers to the self as the unseen seer of all that is seen, the unknown knower of all that is known. To abandon the objective outlook, or the objectifying tendency, inquire within yourself, just as the Maharshi has directed, who am I? And cease to misidentify with the body or any attribute, quality, or definition pertaining to the body. Birth, death, and everything in between. Cease to misidentify with the senses or what is a product of the senses. Similarly, cease to misidentify with thinking, for you cannot be a thought. The existence, which is consciousness, that knows thought, cannot be a thought. And whatever you have thought about yourself at any time is simply not true. Who you are is not to be perceived and is inconceivable. But you are. And you know that you are. And that existence should know itself at that depth, free of any false definition, of all misidentifications or false definitions. The primary one is the notion I, the assumption of existing as some kind of individual to which any amount of definition can be appended. To know yourself, cease to misidentify with that falsely assumed individuality. You can do so simply by inquiring as to the very nature of that I. As Sri Bhagavan has said, if one penetrates into the heart of the ego, only the self is found. For existence is one without a second, and undifferentiated. As it is with the self, so it is with realization of it. In non-dual truth, the realization and the self must be of an identical nature. Just as the self is never a known or unknown object, likewise, self-realization is never an unattained or attained state. That is to say, it is not an event that occurs to an individual. If you wish for self-realization, and therefore liberation from all of the imagined bondage, seek to know yourself. In the course of spiritual practice, it is natural, to a certain extent, to consider self-realization as something that will happen. But when you find your own nature, by a profound inquiry to know yourself, you find that the self alone exists, and the self itself constitutes its realization, the knower, the knowing, and the knowledge being identical, so that being is itself the knowledge, the realization. As there is no ego-entity, no bound individual, so there is no unrealized one or unrealized state for that unrealized one. Of course, this must be actually experienced, realized firsthand. So, inquire. Ceasing to misidentify or to be attached to, ceasing to be misidentified with or being attached to the body, the mind, or an ego. Inquire. Who am I? And if at any point you have a question, please feel free to ask. Or if you wish to relate your own experience, please feel free to speak.
Yesterday was my birthday, so I came for a couple of hours and worked in the garden. I thought was unborn instead of dying.
Yes, a birthday is a splendid opportunity to recall how you are not the body and how you in truth have never been born. That which is unborn is also imperishable.
In this reading, or Bhagavan said that we must practice inquiry with the same intensity as a drowning man seeking air. And I was also thinking that many times my sadhana, the depth of my inquiry is enhanced by difficult situations, like the pain of the body, or challenging situations that are causing me to turn within for strength, or so my attention, my concentration is enhanced seemingly by the challenge, is deepened, so my focus is clearer. So the depth of the inquiry is also deeper. So my question is, how to have that intensity ongoingly without having the stimulus of difficult situations or suffering or pain, because that's really what I don't want to have to generate suffering in order to deepen my sadhana, So
continuous disasters in order to have continuous progress. You already have the facts of life and death. And already you have the desire to be happy at all times. If you're cognizant of that much, it will suffice.
Just keep practicing.
Your happiness and your immortality depend on it. Since it is your very nature to abide in complete happiness, and the least bit of suffering is really too much, as manifested by the desire for happiness, which immediately appears when the innate happiness is veiled. Since this is the case, if you truly recognize the source of happiness, you will be like that drowning man in the analogy. He does not have time or interest to be concerned with anything else, does he? His whole focus is to get to the surface, to get air. There are no distractions for him. Before he recognized he was drowning, he may have had plenty of distractions. Is it an arduous task for him to abandon the distractions?
It seems like the comforts of the seeming comforts of a seeming world sometimes are, bring on a certain kind of lethargy for practice, because it seems as if the comforts bring you satisfaction or happiness. And only when those comforts are somehow threatened or deterred by challenges or suffering, then one's attention is sharper for the practice.
Do the outer events bring on the lethargy, or do inner concepts?
Or what?
Do outer events bring on do they bring on the lethargy, or is it the inner use of your mind?
It's definitely the mind.
So the outer comforts really are quite irrelevant.
I know that intellectually I need to know it more passionately.
You're always desiring your happiness. Determine with certainty where it is found. What you call moments or periods of time of lethargy is just seeking happiness in other ways.
Looking in the wrong direction.
It's not fruitful. It's futile. Determine with certainty what actually is satisfying, completely satisfying. Once that is fully determined within you, there'll be no stopping you.
Is there a point in, is there a time in this timelessness that you drop the inquiry? Or when do you know that the I is completely gone, or you realized it never existed?
If the realization is of the non-existence of an ego I, then such realization is self-evident. As for dropping the inquiry, no such thing ever occurs. It is the end itself, knowledge itself, that appears as the inquiry in practice. Who would drop the inquiry? As long as there is an inquirer, the inquiry should continue. When the nature of the inquirer is thoroughly known, that which was previously called inquiry shines as the constancy of self-luminous knowledge. The individual inquirer is no more. So it is not that the inquiry was dropped. The individual was dropped.
It seems as if although you and many other teachers have talked about that there is no event or there's no event like enlightenment event. Conceptually, that's understood. I understand that intellectually. But there seems to be a sense of incompletion, that there is that and there is this. Like even in the even knowing I am that, it's still that versus this. So there is still that duality that exists in a subtle way. So I don't know how what I'm saying, but this is what is surfacing, and I'm trying to articulate that.
All right.
So how do we drop all that? How do we just totally say, okay, I don't, it's easy to say, okay, I don't want this candy anymore. I don't need to smoke anymore. It can be done. It can be dropped all of a sudden. But there are these thoughts which seem to come randomly. Some of them are laced with this I-ness, and some of them are really very functional, like filling the car with gas or whatever needs to be done. But there are certain types of thoughts which are really loaded with I-ness, and it's very subtle. I mean, on the surface you don't even see it, but when you look, you say, "Oh yeah, this is about the I, the me, And when you see that at that moment, and there is the nothingness about it, but it keeps coming up. It's almost like a program that's just gone astray,
Who did the programming?
Well, it's happened over time, conditioned for one. That's the way I like to. It seems like a helpful analogy for me to think of whether it is genetic programming or educational, parental, whatever it is, we have been all these crappy programs exist, and they keep coming up. All they need is a little trigger of something, even a smell or this or that. It triggers a whole circuitry. And then, okay, you see that, and momentarily it stops, it drops, and you may even have a laugh at it. But there are new ones that take on, like we seem to create new ones, like a spiritual doing, spiritual that, or this or that. There's like new stuff added on. So where's the end to all of this?
Well, the beginning of the end is when you see that you conjure it up and no outer conditioning is the cause. It is your own conjuring up.
You meaning the true self that just created it? I mean, there has to be a source for it.
No, the true self has no ignorance. But if that were known, the question would not arise.
But eventually, ultimately, isn't everything that?
As long as there's the notion of everything, it is better to inquire. When it is said that all is Brahman, the emphasis is on Brahman and not on the all. If we merely say everything is that, the experience is the same as before, we've just added new terms or new thoughts to it. No lasting liberation will come from that. For now, set aside the question whether self-realization is an event or not.
Okay.
It's far more important to know oneself. Then you can decide whether realization is an event or something else. The first thing is to know oneself. You have to see that the ignorance regarding yourself is self-conjured up. The self that appears not to know itself, whoever that may be, is at the root of the ignorance. As long as we blame outer situations and conditions for our ignorance, or for our suffering, or for the creation of our desires, fears, etc., this is not much different than the worldly standpoint that says, from the outside comes our happiness, from the outside comes our suffering. The sign of truly, deeply turning in the spiritual direction is when you have the recognition that the source of happiness, as we were just discussing a few moments ago, is completely within. And the cause of suffering is one's own ignorance, and not any outer circumstance. Once that is seen with certainty, that it's imperative to know that which is within.
Well,
As long as the withinness is not known as it is, in other words, as long as there are unquestioned misidentifications, the tendencies will rise again and again. There may be temporary breaks due to interruption in the thinking, insight, sleep, but the tendencies will recur. At least this is what you were describing. You have to find out for whom these are occurring. What is her nature?
there is no her or him. It just seems to occur. And my question is, how do you see it momentarily, but it may not be the same thing that occurs, but it seems like a very similar type of trigger that keeps, without any volition here.
If it occurs, if delusion or illusion occurs in any form, the I is already assumed. The illusion or delusion must occur for someone. That someone may not have much by way of definition, but that notion of I is already appearing. So find out the nature of that I. The Maharshi says that with the rise of I, everything else rises. With the subsidence of I, everything else subsides. The everything else, from the mental tendencies to the forms of the world, depend on the I, apart from which they have no existence. They just don't happen. And if you examine your mind, you will find that the occurrences of illusion, in whichever way they appear, are not as random as they first seem to appear. Every delusive way of thinking is based on some misidentification, some false definition. And the root of every false definition is this notion of I. You're already there as an experiencer to experience the occurrences, be they gross or subtle. Who is that I? If we know that the ego does not exist, and yet continue as if it does exist, then we don't really know, do we? We may have good insight, we may have some good conviction. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not far enough. That's why it was said earlier, better than the inquiry dropping and the I remaining, the I should drop and the inquiry should remain.
But there will be no inquiry if the I is dropped, right?
Find out. It was also said the end itself is the beginning. That is, the end appears as the means. What is now called inquiry, in the end is found out to be pure consciousness. The pure consciousness, by itself, without the superimposition of any kind of imagined definition, is the knowledge. The idea I am that is not the truth of I am that. The idea of egolessness is not the truth of egolessness.
Right, you could say an egolessness, that itself is an ego.
When the very possibility of the recurrence of any kind of bondage or suffering is utterly eliminated, with no possibility of return, you could say the inquiry is done.
So it's kind of a test in certain situations to see how the system reacts, or?
Well, that's the slow way.
What's that?
Slow or fast doesn't really make much difference as long as it's thorough and deep.
Right.
It is slow to learn by actions or within circumstances. Depth of knowledge is quicker. When there is real wisdom shining within, there's no test for it. It is self-evident.
Self-evident to the being, or self-evident to everybody?
Oh, there's no more any question of everybody.
Yeah.
Just to being. Earlier it was mentioned that knower, knowing, and known are identical in self-knowledge. That is, being is itself the knowledge of itself. Being is not a mode of mind, not an activity, not an object, not a thing. No one does being.
Right. So when teachers say that there is no other, okay, from a scientific point of view, it seems pretty logical to think that, or even to know and accept and confirm within your knowledge base that yes, everything in this universe has this, we share the life force, everything. It's, we are that, but still we have that, I still do have a sense of separation, that you are a separate body, it's a separate body, here's a separate body. And so the oneness experience that a lot of teachers and others talk about that seems like, at least my understanding is that that's the shift that needs to happen to fully drop the singularity, the I-ness of your own individual.
As long as there is I, there will appear to be this. For the subject, there will be the object. If the I is identified with a body, there will appear to be an external world with corresponding sensations and objects. If you are not the body, then what?
Well, it's seems an all right assumption to make you're not the body, but it still seems like you're also the body. You may not be the body only. There's more to it than the body.
All right.
So.
Then everything is only yourself. But when those things appear and disappear, yourself does not appear and disappear. So while all things are only yourself, inclusive of the body, certainly you are not the body nor anything.
Well, that was actually the other question I have had in mind. The self, the unchanging self, the truth, That's how truth is defined, as something that doesn't change. It's the same. It's always the same. But isn't that perhaps our human limitation? Like in terms of the universe not changing, there are things that we cannot perceive the change because we as entities don't exist for eons and eons and eons in one sense. So in the physics of it, we can't really truly measure the change. We are limited by our devices to measure the change. So when people talk about the truth that we, Ramana Maharshi and all the other teachers have talked about not changing, could it be that isn't changing because we don't have the devices to test? Maybe everything is changing. Maybe everything is changing.
Everything changes. Truth is not a thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know what words to say, but it's just, I'm not...
Every phenomenon
right.
has a beginning and an end, a changeful period in between. No matter how long the change may be, things changing over billions of years, etc.
Right.
Still they change. Everything objective changes. What is referred to as truth or real being is non-objective, non-phenomenal. It does not have a beginning, and it does not have an end.
That's what I'm trying to find out. How do we know that for sure?
Again, it is self-evident. Has there ever been a time when you did not exist? Can you imagine a time when you ceased to exist?
Well, not within the frame of my being, birth.
Even after many billions of years, can you imagine a time when you are not? Is it even possible for you to conceive of not being without assuming your own existence?
That's a tough one. I have, you need to repeat that again. I just need to contemplate on that.
Is it possible for you to consider your non-existence without you already existing? Even if you think, I am not, there is one who knows that thought, I am not. It is impossible for you to imagine a state of not existing. You can imagine all things not existing. One short-lived thing is your body, but the body is not you. If that unborn and indestructible existence is known as it is entirely formless, and consequently one without anything other. There cannot be two formlessnesses. Being formless, it is homogeneous. There are no parts in it, and certainly no separate individuality. If this is known, it is known as one's own identity, one's only existence. The existence which is unborn and indestructible, never changing, knows itself in self-knowledge. This is the root of the certainty in the Maharshi's instructions regarding truth.
So, do you think there's a certain degree of faith that one needs to latch on to in the beginning at least?
Faith can be very helpful in spiritual practice. However, do you need to acquire faith in your own existence?
No.
Or we can say the faith is already complete there, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So we start and end there. Start by tracing out the very nature of your existence, experientially, inwardly. And where you end is the very same existence, in utter clarity, without any obscuration. Such is the path of knowledge.
Sometimes it seems a lot more complicated than it should be. I mean life. And at other times it feels like I feel helpless about it.
If you feel helpless, it's best to look toward a higher power. Something that is not limited to the scope of the individual and the body. Something that does not begin and end with events and objects. The very same one that is known as God in relation to all the manifestation, that higher power, is for those who meditate realized to be the inner witnessing consciousness. And for those who realize, it is their own self.
It seems to be that the inner silence one experiences during meditations and during silent witness of everything that's going on seems to be inactive or practically silent, just watching, witnessing. But there's also the aspect of who really is this? How is this awareness there that is witnessing this? So is there something beyond that silence? Like, I don't know, it seems like there's no...
Dive deep into the silence by inquiring, who am I? And find out. In relation to the mind, it is referred to as a witness, assuming that one knows already that the entire universe is in one's mind. But by itself, it is not to be regarded as a witness. It is just one without a second. If you continue to inquire diligently and intensely, detaching yourself from all that you find to be not the self and consequently unreal, you'll find what you're looking for.
Hearing all this now, I've kind of changed my approach. I've been doing a kind of a mental technique where sometimes I'd come up with a thought, and the thought seems so right to me as a conclusion or a perception in regard to a situation or something of that nature. And then I kind of think, well, maybe it's not so. And then I'll investigate it to try to prove myself right or wrong about my thoughts. And sometimes my thoughts are wrong. And
imagine that.
Yeah. Well, I was delighted to find that out, to tell you the truth. And I was bored by the fact that how often my mind is wrong. And then I just realized, what is the futility of going after this? Because if you chop off your thoughts, another thought will just appear. You have to dissolve the ego underneath it seems to me now. So it's almost like, what kind of, all right, I proved that to myself, you know, like, I'm certain about my thoughts and beliefs, and they turn out to be a bunch of baloney. But that, now where do I go? There's no point in continuing trying to solve my thoughts or prove them right or wrong necessarily. You've got to go down to the root and pull it out. If you don't you don't pull out the I thought or the ego, you'll never get the root out, and it'll just keep growing. Something will crawl, it'll come out a little bit different, it'll just keep growing back out again. Something will grow out.
Yes, you have to get to the root, not just trim the branches. However, a man who recognizes that his own thoughts are wrong or mistaken is no longer bound by them.
Yes. Yes. That's the purpose of doing it.
The belief in one's own thinking, one's own thoughts, gives the limitation that's involved in that. If you recognize that your own thinking is an error, you're no longer in error. But you must get to the root.
Yes.
Why you think the way you think is based upon the definitions you have of yourself.
Well, I was going to say before you said that last was that it seems that the thoughts just kind of well up or spring out spontaneously in regards to circumstances that you may be in.
That's far from...
They're not an analytical process where you read and understand something, come up with a conclusion which is rational. It's just sort of something that spontaneously comes out of your subconscious or whatever. They seem to be the most dangerous, and they also have sometimes the conviction attached to them.
Then they're not so spontaneous as you claim they are.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's true.
Other than the fact that you generally don't think them before you think them. But they're not really spontaneous.
Yeah.
They're not natural.
Yeah. Anyway, I think it's better now to work on the ego.
If you're inquiring to know yourself, who am I? Tracing your thoughts back to the basic definitions, the definitions back to the ego notion itself.
Oh. Well, I don't know exactly how to do that, but I might be able to figure that one out.
Well, if you can perceive that your thoughts are based on definitions of yourself, determine what those definitions are. You will find that with all those definitions, the I thought, or I notion, is pivotal. The I itself appears in the guise of the various definitions.
When you say definition, could you also use the word self-perception of yourself?
Sure. Such as for example, the idea that you are a body.
Oh, yeah.
The I is implicit in that. So there's the assumption of I, plus the additional definition of being a body, or being embodied. Within that context, all kinds of trains of thinking can occur. Then we can falsely say the thinking was triggered by an outer circumstance, but it is not so.
Well, now, if you're talking about a chain of thoughts or convictions over maybe billions of lifetimes, I think I've forgotten most of them, you know, and it seems you've got to get back to trace it way back to the source of the original thought. That's kind of a cloudy area. I may be reading into what you're saying, but that's what it seems to me. You've got to get back there.
You don't have to trace it out in time, just trace it subjectively. The fact that you don't remember millions of lifetimes of thoughts is a blessing.
What? It's a good lesson?
It's a blessing.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's pure grace. Imagine if you remembered all that nonsense.
All the other nonsense, too, yeah. But I do think that it is stored subconsciously in the mind, so I may not consciously recall it, but this is what I think happens sometimes when I'm in certain situations. Maybe they're stressful situations, and all of a sudden, boom, up pops this idea in my mind. It has this great power of conviction behind it. This is the reality, it's saying, you know. And then I have traced these things back and find out they are not the reality, but yet they were so convincing. You know?
Well, it's a testimony to the power of faith. That even something entirely unreal can appear as real by the power of your faith. Trace the faith back to its origin. You have the feeling that something is real. Your thought is real.
Yes.
When caught up within the body and the world, you think this, whatever is happening here and now, etc., in your immediate sensory perception, is real.
This is what it
This is what it means. This is real.
Yeah.
That passes, and another set of experiences or thoughts are taken to be real. Those pass, and still another, and another, and another. The quality of being real is the same. The thoughts and the circumstances, the inner, that which is gross and subtle, changes. But the sense of it being real remains the same. From where is that sense of reality derived?
It has to be part of everything all the perception that's part of that is part of that package somehow. So I would assume it's the ego I that is somehow generating this and not the self with a capital S.
The ego notion, even taken as an identity, is felt to be real somehow, that you really are an individual.
That's true.
Where does the reality quality come from? It cannot come from the things which come and go, the thoughts that come and go,
Right.
or the I notion that comes and goes.
There must have been a time when you originally conceived of the idea of I am a separate self.
Perhaps. But even then, the sense of reality comes from some source.
Oh, okay.
Trace that reality to its origin, to its rightful place. For everything, subtle or gross, there is this sense, this is so, this is real. That doesn't change. Your existence does not change. Everything else changes.
Right, so the power behind the illusion. The self, in other words. That's you have to then know it or feel it. You can't intellectualize that.
No, there's nothing intellectual about this knowledge.
Well, I assume if you just keep going deeper and deeper and over this stuff and you want to penetrate into this, that actually that is what will happen. You intend it to be so, and eventually you'll reach that source and point.
There's nothing obstructing you. Go on tracing where the sense of reality comes. Reality and identity are identical. The same is so with happiness. Happiness, identity, and reality are the same. Trace them to their source. That is within. Within does not mean in the body or in the mind. Within indicates that which is non-objective.
So there's a real reality and a delusional or the false reality. And we're living in the false one mostly.
The we and the second reality derive their sense of existence from where?
Oh, okay. Back to that point again. Okay.
Reality is one and one only. Yourself is singular. There are not two of you.
Right.
There's not truly a real self and a false self, a real reality and a false reality. The false or the imagined simply does not exist.
Well, can you sneak up on this in a way, for example, if you understand the quality of the self, and maybe you do the inquiry, but at the same time, you work in a little bhakti yoga, a little bit of bliss, get that going, and that will kind of help bring this about.
Bhakti and jnana are the same.
Pardon?
Bhakti and jnana are the same. Devotion and knowledge are identical. They're one and the same thing,
Yeah.
called by different terms by different people.
Yeah.
As for bliss, it lies where your being is. Your own nature is Satchidananda, being, consciousness, bliss,
Right.
which are one and the same thing. Find yourself, you found bliss. Every time you relinquish some misidentification or some erroneous attachment, your own bliss shines. It is your own freedom that shines.
Then you have to bring it up out of the unconscious, because it seems to me that that's sort of like an unconscious process for many millions and millions of years. If I think back, it's like a blank, so you'll have to somehow penetrate or recognize something as...
Yes, but you know about the unconscious.
Okay. I'm glad to know that.
Otherwise you couldn't speak of it, let alone act upon it. There's nothing unknown.
All right, we're getting back to that again. Okay, all right. Yeah.
This question about the obstruction was good meditation for me, because it made sense how, tracing that reality back to its source. And I've been meditating on that, the Maharshi readings. And we didn't read too much from the Maharshi, but it seemed like consistently the assumption has to be questioned, because it's all based off this assumption of an ego, and that has to be investigated. So that sort of made sense to me Friday night, that, and I don't know why it made sense, but it really made a lot of sense to me, that if I just follow those notions instead of inquiring, then it can lead to anything. But if I just introvert the mind with that question, not necessarily a question per se, but that desire to kind of understand internally what that means, is pretty cool.
When you follow an idea, who follows and where does he go?
Well, I was thinking about that, because it's like the mind moves, and it's like, oh, it moved.
But where does it move?
That is not a question, yeah.
We loosely speak of the mind moving, but where is it moving?
It's not like a watch which, is spinning around. I mean, it seems like the mind's spinning around.
What is the thing that spins? What is the nature of your mind?
Yeah, because what I was calling my mind in that case was the ego and all its attributes, right? And it seems like they take on all these different attributes. But is that real?
Have you ever seen the ego?
And others?
That is not seen. I mean, I'm sort of saying that loosely, but because I think if I really saw that, then there wouldn't be any ignorance. Right?
No one has ever seen an ego at any time. Its apparent existence relies on non-inquiry. If you so much as inquire as to what it is, who am I? It is like going to look at darkness while holding a lamp.
It's that obvious. Yeah, the fact that there's no obstruction at all, not a iota. You know, this is sort of at a very high level, obviously, but there isn't any other level here. Right? There's not, I mean, Maharshi's teachings say there's no levels in that sense.
There can be no levels of reality. And levels of unreality are as unreal as the unreality itself. But the real ever is, and the unreal never comes to be.
So anytime there's an appearance, see, I think that's the confusion. It's like ignorance obviously causes suffering. And that doesn't feel right, as we've discussed. And that sort of causes, you know, like a search for obviously something deeper. Or the mistaken aspect of it, I guess. That tracing out is so clear because it's really, doesn't seem like it has anything to do with the ignorance. The ignorance part is just more gunk anyway, right? There's no sense in, you know, going through that. But it's always the same thing, investigating the self, its nature, or whatever that is, myself.
You experience nothing but the self, always. All that is necessary is to know the self as it really is. Being non-dual and undifferentiated, there is nothing beyond it, nor is there anything else within it.
I recently read a dialogue between Ramana and a seeker that has really stuck with me, and I'll see if I can remember it pretty close. The seeker says something like, I don't think I can follow this training or this teaching. I'm weak. I'm not a good person. And Ramana responded with something like, it's the greatest error for a man to consider himself evil or weak, because your true nature is strong and good. I'll say it simply. And he said that it's only the thoughts that are evil and weak. And as I read it, it just, it rang so true to me that since I read that, when a negative thought, or a simple way, if I start to think poorly of myself, having heard that from Ramana and seeing that it's true, it's quite easy just by the knowledge of it to stop it. It's like, wait a minute, I'm not going there anymore. That's done with that. But the fact that it arose is a concern. So it's like, take it a little bit deeper. It's like, but wait a minute, where did that come from? What? How could I think badly about myself when I know that that's not who I am? So sometimes if I'm involved in work with something where it's like there is such a fast pace that I need to keep up with for the next couple of hours, that it's just like, if I start having a thought, oh, I don't know if I'm capable of finishing this. It's just like, no, go away, I am finishing this. Sometimes there just doesn't seem to be the opportunity to inquire into the source of that at that moment. And so it'll just be, I'll just set it aside. And usually I won't think of it later on. It may rise again. And if it does, then I take care of it then. Is it a mistake to set it aside at that time? Or
replacing a thought with another thought will give a temporary break. But the original thought, which was binding or troublesome, will return sooner or later. Inquiry, as you know, is not a thought process. If it is relegated to a thought process, you may not have the time. If inquiry is of the nature of thought transcendent knowledge, the question about time is moot. The way to get to the Maharshi's meaning might be regarded as utter humility. When a person is thinking poorly about himself, he's thinking too much about himself.
is he actually thinking about himself? Truly?
In the context of what you're describing.
Yes, okay. So if I understand what you're saying, it's actually arrogant to think of to actually think of yourself in any way.
That's clear. Any amount of thinking of yourself as good won't make you good. If you're good already, it's redundant. If you believe otherwise, thinking to the contrary will not necessarily uproot the original thought. But inquiry that questions your very identity dissolves the thought at its root.
It also makes me question what could be more important than inquiring right at the moment. I mean, there's very few times when the bus is ready to run me over, really, if you understand what I'm saying. Most of the time it's an imagined emergency. Not really emergency, but something's more important.
On the other hand, you might be in an emergency situation all the time. It's called life and death. It's with us always.
The bus is coming, in other words.
You better inquire. As certainly as there was birth, there is death. The bus is coming. You definitely better inquire.
It's on its way. Yeah.
Last question for this morning.
Lately I've been aware of just going through my life, and occasionally what will happen is that I'll have the awareness, I'll say something to myself. Well, I'm aware, for example, I'm watching the latest stuff maybe on Torture on TV, and I notice that the thought is, out of the blue, I say to myself, well, it's very complicated. Just that I become aware that I was feeling unconscious, that I was feeling unconsciously maybe guilty. And then the thought that follows directly after that is that I'm not guilty of what was priorly unconscious. What it suggests is that there's a level of thought going on, making me aware of some level of disease I wasn't even aware of having it and then releasing it. And I'm just sort of given this gift of a release of suffering that I was only vaguely aware I was experiencing. It suggests that there's a level of mentation, of release going on that's completely unconscious, at least to my everyday mind. Is that kind of how inquiry works?
In what way do you see a parallel to inquiry?
Only that I'm first of all not even aware that I'm uncomfortable in an area or suffering. And then the only thought that comes is, you are not that. And then I'm relieved of a suffering that I'm only at that point aware that I was experiencing. And I had no sense of volition in the whole process. This is something that happens about every week or two.
And where is the parallel to inquiry?
A moment of detachment, a moment of non-identification, a moment of joy.
All right.
That I apparently had nothing to do with.
Okay. Yet it was for you, so you had everything to do with it.
True.
You just didn't plan it out beforehand.
I had no plan. I wasn't even aware that I was suffering until I had the thought that I wasn't that, and then I felt a release. And
why is it just a moment?
I'm not putting much effort into this, so that it happens at all is a gift.
What would occur if you did apply effort?
What's that?
What would be the difference if you did apply effort?
When I was coming here a few years ago, and I came fairly regularly for a while, and the one piece of advice that you gave me was to only meditate when I wanted to. It took me about 2 years to take advantage of that advice. It took me a long time to be able to meditate every day, and I didn't want to give it up. When I finally gave it up, my life opened up considerably. I felt much more relieved not meditating than doing this whole process.
Then what you were doing previously was not meditation.
Yet I felt enormous benefit for what I gave up, it seemed like.
Now, what do you think it is that certain yogis find that causes them to remain in meditation all the time?
I would imagine joy.
So they're only meditating when they want to.
See, that's my problem, is I'm much more happy not than I gave up doing it. My life is better without it, it appears.
All right. Are you fully satisfied?
No.
Why not?
For all sorts of everyday reasons. You know, just identifications with this and that. Anxiety, drivenness, those sorts of things.
What do you plan to do about that?
Well, I feel like I'm in a complete cul-de-sac. It doesn't seem like meditation really helps me. Well, okay, it doesn't seem like the meditation that I was doing before, which was apparently inquiry, it was very helpful. Yet doing nothing is not helpful. Well,
so why not find a wiser way of meditating?
Because I've read the books, a zillion times. There's something fundamentally flawed that I don't get.
When you read the books, how do you read them?
Probably not slow enough.
Just quantity of reading is not the same thing as understanding as you read. Well, likewise is it with applying the spiritual instruction received. If you're not satisfied, the dissatisfaction, which is an intuition of your real state being one that's completely satisfactory, that should be your right state or your natural state. The dissatisfaction will continue to drive you, push you. At some point you need to discern how to fulfill that drive. How can that reach its culmination? When you question like that, meditating upon the nature of the meditator will become significant for you. You will also find that there is something in you that is not thought, not any layer or level of thought, far more real than any thought.
I have experienced that. I mean, after one of the weekends I went to, I did have a process of spontaneous inquiry that went on for some period of time.
All right, there is experience. Indeed, everyone has some experience of the self. No one is without it. When the drive to be free of suffering entirely turns you entirely within, so that you meditate upon the meditator, you'll be meditating when you want to, which will become always. You'll cease to regard the various convoluted layers of your mind as definitions of yourself. You'll cease to regard yourself as one who is traveling through the mind, encapsulated in the mind, going from one state to another, one mode to another. And as a result of such cessation of misidentification, you'll become very happy at heart, quite free. You will see that there is nothing hidden. Wisdom is openly revealed, and there's nothing hidden about the ignorance either. You'll find that now, that what you now refer to as being unconscious and so forth, or subconscious, you actually knew about it all the time. There was nothing hidden. Because there is nothing hidden, you can be free of it entirely. As you inquire, you'll have the distinct revelation within yourself. I knew this all the time. That is true about the truth of your real nature, and it's also true about the characteristics of your ignorance. Find a way in wisdom.